The morning mist clung to the ancient pine trees surrounding the Matsudaira estate like the whispered secrets of our ancestors. I, Matsudaira Yoshimiyan, had served the Tokugawa shogunate for 43 years, my katana never once dishonored, my family name carried with the weight of 5 generations of samurai virtue. But on that fateful spring morning in the 7th year of Jinroku, as I prepared for the most prestigious tea ceremony of my lifetime, I had no idea that the very foundation of everything I held sacred was about to crumble beneath my feet. The cherry blossoms had reached their peak bloom, their delicate petals dancing on the gentle breeze that carried the scent of incense from the household shrine. My wife, Chiyo, had risen before dawn to ensure every detail of our preparation was flawless. The Imperial tea ceremony was not merely a social gathering, it was the pinnacle of cultural refinement, a sacred ritual where the shogun's most trusted retainers would demonstrate their mastery of the way of tea, their understanding of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. As I adjusted my formal hakama, the silk rustling with the reverence due such an occasion, I reflected on the path that had brought our family to this moment of honor. The Matsudaira name had been forged in the fires of countless battles, tempered by decades of loyal service to the Tokugawa. We were not merely samurai, we were the embodiment of Bushido, the living testament to the values that held the realm together during these peaceful years of the Edo period. The transformation of Japan under the Tokugawa had been remarkable. Where once the country had been torn apart by warring daimyo, now a sophisticated system of governance maintained order from the northernmost reaches of Ezo to the southern islands of Kyushu. The Sankin-Kotai system ensured that provincial lords maintained residences both in their domains and in Edo, creating a complex web of political relationships that required the most delicate navigation. In this world, a family's reputation was everything, more valuable than gold, more precious than the finest silk from Nishigen. My daughter-in-law, Yukiko, had married into our family 3 years prior. She was the daughter of a respected merchant family that had prospered during the Jinroku cultural boom. Her father, Yamada Jinzaman, had built his fortune in the textile trade, supplying the elaborate fabrics that adorned the courtesans of the Yoshiwara pleasure quarter and the refined ladies of the samurai class. When my eldest son, Tadamian, had fallen deeply in love with her grace and intelligence, I had blessed the union despite the subtle social complexities of marrying across class lines. Yukiko possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed to capture the very essence of the floating world that poets and artists celebrated in their works. Her movements carried the refined elegance of someone trained in the most sophisticated cultural arts. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, calligraphy, and the classical dance forms that had evolved in the pleasure quarters of Edo. But more than her physical beauty, it was her sharp intelligence and apparent understanding of samurai values that had convinced me she would be a worthy addition to our family legacy. The morning of the imperial ceremony, I found Yukiko in the tea house, practicing the precise movements that would be required during the formal proceedings. The tea house itself was a masterpiece of architectural harmony, designed according to the principles established by the great tea master Sen no Rikyu over a century earlier. The 4.5 tatami space created an atmosphere of intimate equality where social distinctions theoretically dissolved in the pursuit of aesthetic perfection. Watching Yukiko prepare was like observing a meditation in motion. Each gesture flowed seamlessly into the next. The careful cleaning of the tea bowl, the measured scooping of the powdered green tea, the rhythmic whisking that would create the perfect foam. Her silk kimono, decorated with subtle patterns of autumn maple leaves, rustled softly as she moved through the practiced choreography of the ceremony. The morning light filtering through the shoji screens cast delicate shadows that seemed to dance with her movements. "Honored father," she said, bowing deeply as I entered the tea house, "I have been preparing since before dawn to ensure that our family's reputation will shine like polished steel at today's ceremony." Her words filled me with pride, but there was something in her tone, a subtle undertone that I couldn't quite identify, that gave me the slightest pause. In the complex world of Edo period social interactions, the ability to read between the lines of conversation was essential. Every gesture, every inflection, every pause carried meaning that extended far beyond the surface of words. The imperial tea ceremony was to be held at the Honmaru Palace within Edo Castle, in the presence of Shogun Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi himself. Only 20 families had been invited, the most distinguished representatives of the samurai class, chosen for their impeccable service records and their mastery of cultural refinement. It was an honor that reflected not just on our immediate family, but on the entire lineage that stretched back to our ancestors who had fought alongside Tokugawa Ieyasu at the decisive Battle of Sekigahara. As we prepared to depart for the castle, I noticed that Yukiko seemed unusually nervous. Her hands, normally steady as mountain stone during tea preparation, trembled slightly as she adjusted her obi. When I inquired about her well-being, she assured me that she was merely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the honor we were about to receive. The journey to Edo Castle took us through the heart of the city that had become the largest urban center in the world. The streets bustled with merchants hawking their wares, artisans creating exquisite crafts, and samurai conducting the business of governance. The Sumida River flowed lazily beside us, carrying cargo boats loaded with rice from distant provinces and luxury goods from the port of Nagasaki, where carefully controlled trade with Dutch and Chinese merchants brought exotic items into Japan. The castle itself rose before us like a monument to the power and stability of the Tokugawa regime. Its massive stone foundations and elegant wooden superstructures represented the pinnacle of Japanese architectural achievement. The complex system of moats, gates, and defensive walls spoke to a military heritage, while the refined palace buildings within demonstrated the sophisticated culture that had flourished during the peaceful decades of Tokugawa rule. As we passed through the succession of gates, each one representing another level of privilege and access, I felt the weight of 5 generations of family honor settling on my shoulders. The guards at each checkpoint examined our credentials with respectful efficiency, their recognition of our family name evident in their deferential bows. The tea house where the ceremony would take place was located in the most private section of the palace complex, adjacent to the shogun's personal gardens. The building itself was a masterpiece of understatement, its natural wood surfaces weathered to a perfect patina, its proportions calculated to create an atmosphere of serene contemplation. Ancient pine trees, some planted during the reign of the first Tokugawa shogun, cast gentle shadows over the carefully raked gravel pathways. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and reverence. 20 families, representing the cream of samurai society, had gathered to participate in this most refined of cultural expressions. The men wore their most formal court dress, silk hakama in subdued colors, family crests prominently displayed, their katana and wakizashi polished to mirror brightness. The women, including Yukiko, wore kimono of extraordinary elegance, their hair arranged in the complex styles that indicated their high social status. Shogun Tsuneyoshi himself presided over the gathering with a dignified bearing that had earned him the sobriquet, the Dog Shogun, for his compassionate edicts protecting animals. His presence transformed the tea ceremony from a cultural exercise into a sacred ritual that connected the present moment to the eternal principles of harmony and respect that governed the ideal society. The ceremony began with the ritual purification of the tea implements. Each bowl, each whisk, each bamboo scoop was cleansed not just of physical impurities but of spiritual contamination. The tea master, an elderly man whose family had served the Tokugawa for 3 generations, moved with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that every gesture carried symbolic meaning. As the first round of tea was prepared and served, I observed the subtle interactions between the assembled families with the practiced eye of someone who had navigated the complex currents of court society for decades. The Hosokawa family patriarch exchanged meaningful glances with representatives of the Kuroda clan, while the ladies discussed the latest developments in No theater and the publication of new illustrated books by the master printmakers of Edo. It was during the second round of the ceremony, as Yukiko was preparing to demonstrate her own mastery of the tea arts, that I first noticed something was amiss. As she knelt to begin her preparation, I saw her hands shake, not with nervousness, but with what appeared to be barely contained emotion. Her movements, usually flowing and graceful, seemed stilted and uncertain. The tea master called upon each family to demonstrate their refinement through the preparation and serving of tea to their fellow guests. When our turn arrived, Yukiko rose with apparent composure, but I could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the slight tremor in her breathing. As she began the ritual cleansing of the tea bowl, her movements grew increasingly erratic. The measured precision that characterized proper tea ceremony technique gave way to hurried, almost frantic gestures. The other guests began to notice the deviation from proper form, and I saw subtle exchanges of glances that spoke to their growing concern. Then, as Yukiko reached for the tea whisk, her composure finally shattered completely. Instead of the controlled whisking motion that would create the proper foam, she began to sob, quietly at first, then with increasing intensity. The sound of her weeping filled the sacred space of the tea house like a crack of thunder in a clear sky. The shogun himself looked up from his contemplation of the tea bowl in his hands, his expression shifting from serene satisfaction to concern and then to something approaching alarm. In the rigidly controlled environment of the Edo court, such a display of emotion was not merely inappropriate, it was potentially catastrophic. I moved quickly to Yukiko's side, hoping to restore order before the situation deteriorated further. But as I knelt beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, she looked up at me with eyes that held not just sorrow, but guilt so profound it seemed to emanate from her very soul. "Honored father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her weeping, "I can no longer bear the weight of what I have done. The shame is eating away at my spirit like rust consuming steel." The entire gathering had fallen into stunned silence. 20 families, the cream of samurai society, sat motionless as my daughter-in-law's breakdown threatened to transform the most refined cultural gathering of the season into a scene of public disgrace. "What is it, child?" I asked, keeping my voice low and gentle despite the growing panic I felt at the unprecedented nature of the situation. "What burden weighs so heavily on your heart?" Her response shattered my understanding of reality as completely as an earthquake shatters the foundations of a building. "I have sold our family name," she whispered, the words falling like drops of poison into the sacred atmosphere of the tea house. "I have taken money from merchants and moneylenders, using the Matsudaira reputation as collateral for debts I cannot repay. Our honor is no longer our own. It belongs to those who hold our promissory notes." The silence that followed her confession was so complete it seemed to absorb sound itself. Even the gentle whisper of wind through the pine trees outside seemed to pause in recognition of the magnitude of what had just been revealed. In the rigid social hierarchy of Edo period Japan, family honor was not merely a personal attribute, it was the fundamental currency of social interaction. A samurai family's reputation, built over generations of loyal service and moral behavior, was the foundation upon which all their relationships, privileges, and responsibilities rested. To compromise that reputation through commercial entanglements was not just a personal failing, it was a betrayal of the entire social order that maintained the stability of the realm. The implications of Yukiko's confession began to cascade through my consciousness like stones tumbling down a mountainside. If our family name had been used as collateral for commercial debts, our honor was no longer our own to control. Every decision we made, every action we took, every relationship we maintained could potentially be influenced by those who held financial power over us. We had become, in effect, servants to merchants and moneylenders, a complete inversion of the proper social order. The shogun's expression had shifted from concern to something approaching horror. In the carefully maintained hierarchy of Tokugawa society, the revelation that a distinguished samurai family had compromised its honor through commercial entanglements represented a crack in the very foundation of the system. If the warrior class, the traditional guardians of moral virtue and social stability, could not maintain their own integrity, what hope was there for the proper functioning of society as a whole? I felt the eyes of every person in the tea house upon me, waiting to see how I would respond to this unprecedented crisis. The ancient codes of Bushido provided guidance for dealing with external enemies, with questions of loyalty and courage in battle, with the proper relationships between lord and retainer. But they offered little wisdom for navigating the complex moral terrain of family betrayal and commercial dishonor. My first instinct was to restore order through action, to remove Yukiko from the gathering, to minimize the damage to our family's reputation, to find some way to contain the crisis before it could spread further. But as I looked into her tear-stained face, I saw something that gave me pause. Despite her guilt and shame, There was also a kind of desperate honesty that reminded me of the courage required to face one's deepest failures. "Tell me everything," I said quietly, my voice carrying the authority of a man who had led troops into battle and governed provinces in the shogun's name. "Hold nothing back. In this sacred space, before these witnesses, speak the complete truth of what has transpired." Yukiko's story emerged in fragments, punctuated by tears and long pauses as she struggled to find words for actions that had no precedent in her understanding of proper behavior. "It began," she explained, "with her father's business difficulties. The textile trade that had made the Yamada family prosperous had suffered severe setbacks due to changes in fashion and increased competition from artisans in Kyoto and Osaka. Rather than accept the natural ebb and flow of commercial fortune, Yamada Jinzaemon had sought to maintain his family's lifestyle through increasingly desperate borrowing. When legitimate moneylenders became reluctant to extend further credit, he had turned to less reputable sources. Merchants who operated in the gray areas of Edo's commercial underworld, men who understood that a samurai family's reputation could be more valuable than silver or gold. Yukiko had initially been unaware of her father's difficulties. But when creditors began to pressure him for repayment, he had approached her with a request that seemed reasonable on the surface. Would she be willing to use her position as a member of the distinguished Matsudaira family to guarantee certain business transactions? The money would be used for legitimate commercial purposes, and the loans would be repaid quickly and quietly. What began as a single transaction had gradually expanded into a complex web of obligations. Each loan required additional guarantees. Each guarantee created new vulnerabilities. Before Yukiko fully understood what was happening, the Matsudaira name had been attached to debts totaling more than 10,000 ryo, a sum so vast that even our family's considerable resources could not hope to repay it within a reasonable time frame. The creditors, she revealed, were not simply moneylenders interested in profit. They were part of a sophisticated network that understood the political value of having financial leverage over distinguished samurai families. By accumulating debts backed by family honor, they were creating a form of influence that operated outside the traditional channels of governance and social control. As Yukiko's confession continued, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. She was not the only samurai wife who had been approached with seemingly reasonable requests for financial guarantees. The network had systematically targeted families throughout the warrior class, creating a web of financial obligations that could potentially be used to influence political decisions and social developments. The shogun himself had begun to lean forward, his attention completely focused on Yukiko's revelations. What had begun as a personal family crisis was revealing itself to be a threat to the stability of the entire social order. If merchant networks could gain financial control over significant portions of the samurai class, the traditional hierarchy that maintained peace and prosperity throughout the realm could be undermined from within. But even as the political implications of the situation became clear, I found myself grappling with more personal questions about honor, family loyalty, and moral responsibility. Yukiko had betrayed our trust and compromised our family's reputation, but she had done so out of filial devotion to her birth family and apparent ignorance of the broader consequences of her actions. The codes of Bushido demanded that honor be maintained at all costs, even unto death. A samurai who had compromised his integrity through commercial entanglements would traditionally restore his honor through seppuku, ritual suicide that demonstrated his commitment to virtue over life itself. But Yukiko was not a samurai by birth. She was a merchant's daughter who had married into our family, and whose understanding of honor had been shaped by different traditions and expectations. Moreover, the situation was not simply a matter of personal failing. If Yukiko's revelations were accurate, she had been manipulated by sophisticated actors who understood exactly how to exploit the social dynamics of Edo period Japan. She was as much a victim of this conspiracy as its unwitting agent. As these thoughts raced through my mind, I became aware that the other guests in the tea house were waiting for my response. How I handled this unprecedented crisis would not only determine the fate of my own family but would potentially influence how similar situations might be addressed throughout the warrior class. I rose slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled despite the turmoil in my heart. The formal protocols of the tea ceremony seemed almost absurd in light of what had just been revealed, but the ancient rituals provided a framework for maintaining dignity even in the face of catastrophe. "Honored guests," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sacred space of the tea house, "what you have witnessed today is indeed unprecedented in the annals of our class. A member of my family has revealed actions that compromise not only our personal honor but the integrity of the social order we all serve to maintain." The shogun nodded slightly, acknowledging both the gravity of the situation and my apparent willingness to address it directly rather than attempting to minimize or deflect responsibility. "However," I continued, "I believe that true honor lies not in the absence of failure but in how we respond when failure is revealed. My daughter-in-law has shown courage in confessing her actions publicly, despite the personal cost of such honesty. She has provided information that reveals a conspiracy against the very foundations of our society." I turned to face Yukiko directly, and saw in her eyes a mixture of fear and hope that reminded me of my own children when they had been young and had broken some precious object through carelessness. "Yukiko," I said formally, "your actions have brought shame upon our family and threatened the stability of the realm. According to the strictest interpretation of Bushido, such dishonor can only be addressed through the ultimate sacrifice. However, I believe that your honest confession and the valuable intelligence you have provided about this conspiracy demonstrate that your spirit, while misguided, remains fundamentally honorable." The declaration sent ripples of surprise through the assembled guests. To publicly forgive such a breach of honor was unprecedented, potentially setting a dangerous precedent for how similar situations might be handled in the future. "Therefore," I announced, "I propose a different path to redemption. Instead of death, I sentence you to life. A life dedicated to exposing and destroying the network that has attempted to corrupt our class through financial manipulation. You will work with the shogun's officials to identify every family that has been approached by these conspirators, every debt that has been used to compromise samurai honor, every connection in this web of corruption." The shogun's eyes brightened with understanding and approval. Rather than simply punishing individual failure, I was proposing to transform the crisis into an opportunity to strengthen the entire social system. "Furthermore," I continued, "our family will liquidate all of our assets except those necessary for basic survival. Every coin, every precious object, every piece of property that can be sold will be converted to money for repaying these debts. We will accept poverty before we accept dishonor, and we will demonstrate that the warrior class values integrity above material comfort." The practical implications of this decision were staggering. Our family had accumulated wealth over 5 generations of service to the Tokugawa. Ancient swords passed down from our ancestors, rare artworks gifted by grateful lords, properties that generated the income necessary to maintain our social position. All would be sacrificed to restore our honor and strike back against those who had attempted to corrupt the social order. But as I spoke these words, I felt a sense of liberation that I had not anticipated. For too many years, the peaceful prosperity of the Edo period had gradually softened the warrior spirit that was the true source of samurai strength. We had become comfortable, perhaps even complacent, allowing material concerns to cloud our understanding of what truly mattered. The crisis that Yukiko had precipitated was also an opportunity to rediscover the essential values that made the samurai class the guardians of Japanese society. By choosing honor over comfort, principle over convenience, we would be demonstrating to the entire realm that the warrior spirit remained alive and capable of meeting new challenges with ancient virtues. The shogun rose from his position at the head of the tea house, his movement causing every person present to bow deeply in respect. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had governed the most complex society on earth for more than 2 decades. "Matsudaira Yoshimune," he said formally, "your response to this crisis demonstrates why your family has served mine with distinction for 5 generations. You have transformed a moment of potential disaster into an opportunity for strengthening the foundations of our realm." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the gathering like incense smoke. "I hereby appoint you as special investigator with full authority to root out this conspiracy against the warrior class. You will have access to all the resources of the shogunate, and you will report directly to me on your progress." The network that has attempted to corrupt our society through financial manipulation will be exposed and destroyed. The transformation of a tea ceremony into a moment of historical significance was complete. What had begun as a cultural gathering celebrating the refined arts had become the launching point for a campaign to preserve the integrity of Japanese society itself. As we prepared to leave the sacred space of the tea house, I reflected on the strange turns that life can take. This morning, I had been a comfortable, respected member of the warrior class, concerned primarily with maintaining traditions and enjoying the fruits of generations of loyal service. This evening, I would return home as the leader of a crusade against forces that threatened the very foundations of the world I had spent my entire life defending. Yukiko walked beside me as we made our way through the castle complex, her tears replaced by a determined expression that reminded me of her samurai husband when he had first pledged his service to our family's cause. The shame and guilt that had overwhelmed her during the tea ceremony had been transformed into something approaching righteous anger against those who had exploited her family loyalty for their own corrupt purposes. The journey back through the bustling streets of Edo took on new meaning in light of what had transpired. The merchants hawking their wares, the artisans creating beautiful objects, the complex commercial networks that made the city the largest urban center in the world. All of these represented both the prosperity that Tokugawa rule had created and the potential vulnerabilities that enemies of the social order might exploit. As we crossed the Sumida River, I looked back at the castle rising majestically above the city and reflected on the responsibility that had been placed upon my shoulders. The shogun's trust was not merely a personal honor. It was a sacred duty that connected me to the fundamental purposes for which the warrior class existed. The investigation that lay ahead would require all the skills I had developed over decades of service, the ability to read between the lines of complex social interactions, the patience to unravel sophisticated deceptions, the courage to confront powerful interests that operated in the shadows of legitimate society. But it would also require something more. The wisdom to distinguish between the preservation of valuable traditions and the evolution necessary to meet new challenges. That evening, as our family gathered in the main hall of our residence for the first time since the morning's crisis, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Our servants, who had heard whispered accounts of what had transpired at the castle, moved with the careful efficiency of people who understood that their world had fundamentally changed. My son Tadamune, Yukiko's husband, had spent the day wrestling with the implications of his wife's confession. As a samurai trained from childhood in the codes of honor and duty, he understood better than anyone the magnitude of what had been revealed. But as a husband who loved his wife deeply, he was also struggling to reconcile his personal feelings with his obligations to family and class. "Father," he said as we knelt around the low table where our evening meal had been prepared, "I have spent this day examining my own conscience and my responsibilities as both your son and Yukiko's husband. I believe I must share responsibility for what has occurred." I nodded, recognizing in his words the kind of moral courage that had characterized our family for 5 generations. "A samurai husband," he continued, "should understand the full scope of his wife's activities and concerns. If I had been more attentive to Yukiko's relationship with her birth family, if I had taken greater interest in their commercial difficulties, perhaps I could have prevented this crisis before it developed." His self-examination was both admirable and painful to witness. The complex social dynamics of Edo period marriage made it difficult for husbands and wives to maintain complete openness about family obligations that extended beyond their immediate household. But Tadamune was correct that greater awareness of Yukiko's circumstances might have prevented the crisis from developing. "Your self-reflection honors our family," I replied, "but we cannot change what has already occurred. Our responsibility now is to ensure that the lessons we have learned today serve to strengthen not just our own integrity but the integrity of the entire social order." Yukiko, who had remained silent throughout the meal, finally looked up from her barely touched food. "Honored father," she said quietly, "I understand that the path you have chosen for our family will require great sacrifices. But I want you to know that I am prepared to dedicate my entire life to repairing the damage I have caused. If working with the shogun's officials can prevent other families from falling into the same trap, then perhaps some good can come from my failures." Her words carried a dignity that reminded me why my son had fallen in love with her intelligence and moral sensitivity. The crisis had revealed weaknesses in her judgment, but it had also demonstrated strengths of character that could be channeled toward constructive purposes. As the evening progressed, we began the practical work of planning the investigation that the shogun had entrusted to our family. Yukiko's detailed knowledge of the financial network that had ensnared her father would be invaluable in identifying other families who might have been approached with similar offers. Her understanding of how the conspiracy operated would provide crucial intelligence for dismantling it. But the investigation would require more than information. It would demand a sophisticated understanding of how traditional social structures were being challenged by new forms of economic power. The merchants and moneylenders who had created this network were not simply criminals seeking short-term profit. They were visionaries who understood that financial influence could potentially reshape the entire political landscape of Japan. The implications extended far beyond the immediate crisis facing our family. If commercial interests could gain effective control over significant portions of the warrior class, the traditional relationship between social status and political power would be fundamentally altered. The careful balance that maintained stability throughout the realm would be replaced by new dynamics that favored economic cunning over moral virtue. As I prepared for sleep that night, I found myself thinking about the broader historical forces that had created the conditions for this crisis. The peaceful prosperity of the Edo period had indeed softened some aspects of warrior culture, but it had also created opportunities for sophisticated forms of corruption that would have been impossible during the constant warfare of earlier eras. The challenge facing our family was not simply to restore our personal honor, but to help the entire samurai class adapt to new threats while maintaining the essential values that justified our position in society. We would need to prove that the warrior spirit could evolve to meet changing circumstances without losing its fundamental commitment to integrity and service. The following morning began a period of investigation that would ultimately span several months and expose a conspiracy far more extensive than any of us had initially imagined. Working closely with officials from the shogun's intelligence network, we gradually mapped the full scope of the financial web that had been constructed around vulnerable samurai families. The sophistication of the operation was remarkable. Rather than targeting families randomly, the conspirators had carefully studied the social dynamics of warrior society to identify those most susceptible to financial pressure. They had researched family histories, commercial relationships, and personal circumstances with the thoroughness of military strategists planning a campaign. But they had underestimated the resilience of the values they sought to corrupt. As news of our investigation spread throughout the samurai class, family after family came forward to report similar approaches from mysterious moneylenders offering seemingly attractive terms for loans backed by family honor. What the conspirators had intended as a secret network of financial control was transformed into a comprehensive intelligence operation that exposed their entire organization. The final confrontation took place not in the dramatic setting of a battlefield or castle, but in the mundane commercial district where the conspiracy had been headquartered. When the shogun's officials finally moved to arrest the network's leaders, they found detailed records documenting the full scope of the operation, including plans to extend their influence into the highest levels of government. The victory, however, came at a personal cost that would reshape our family's circumstances for generations. True to the promise I had made during the tea ceremony, we had liquidated virtually all of our accumulated wealth to repay the debts that had been incurred in our name. We retained only our ancestral home and the basic possessions necessary to maintain our dignity as members of the warrior class. But as I surveyed our reduced circumstances from the garden where I now spent my mornings in contemplation, I felt a satisfaction that material comfort had never provided. We had faced a crisis that threatened not just our personal honor but the stability of the social order itself, and we had emerged with our integrity not just intact but strengthened. Yukiko had indeed dedicated her life to repairing the damage her actions had caused. Her work with the shogun's investigators had been instrumental in exposing the full scope of the conspiracy, and her ongoing efforts to educate other families about the dangers of financial manipulation had prevented similar crises from developing elsewhere. The investigation had also revealed important insights about the evolution of Japanese society during the Edo period. The conspiracy we had exposed was not simply a criminal enterprise, but a symptom of larger changes that were gradually altering the relationship between social status and economic power. Understanding these changes would be crucial for maintaining the stability and prosperity that characterized Tokugawa rule. As I reflect now on that transformative spring morning when our world changed forever, I am struck by the unexpected ways that personal crisis can illuminate broader truths about society and history. What began as a family's moment of shame became a turning point in the ongoing evolution of Japanese civilization. The tea ceremony that was interrupted by Yukiko's confession has become, in memory, a symbol of the delicate balance between tradition and change that defines any healthy society. The ancient rituals that seemed so important in the morning proved flexible enough to accommodate unprecedented challenges, while the values they represented provided the foundation for meeting new threats with old virtues. And perhaps most importantly, the crisis taught our family that true honor lies not in the absence of failure, but in the courage to confront failure honestly and transform it into wisdom that serves future generations. In the end, that may be the most enduring lesson of our encounter with betrayal and redemption in the elegant, complex world of feudal Japan.